Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and I just got back from the new film, The World's End. It is the final film in the Cornetto trilogy. Gary King, played by Simon Pegg, who wants to get his friends back together and recreate their legendary pub crawl, which they were never really successful at. That happened in 1990, and he wants to go back with his friends to his old village where they all grew up to do the pub crawl and do 12 pubs in one night, 12 pints, kind of relive his glory days. And he gets them all back together. They all have jobs and kids and wives for the most part. His life hasn't gone so well. He's in AA. He's still wearing the same crap he wore from 1990. He hasn't really evolved, but he wants to go back and relive his time in this place, and hopefully everyone will recognize him. And he goes back and no one recognizes him as they're doing the Golden Mile, this legendary pub crawl. And they slowly realize that everyone in their town has been replaced by robots. They're trying to defeat these robots while at the same time Gary is trying to keep them going on this legendary pub crawl to finish before the night is over. The World's End is fitting not just because that's the last pub in the pub crawl and various other things in the film, but also because I think this is a good ending to a lot of the themes they started in Shaun of the Dead. And this film is pretty related, I think, theme-wise and feel, and the writing is more similar to Shaun of the Dead. And this film seems to be taking its view of maturity in a much more serious way, a much darker way. It's not as fun as it used to be in Shaun of the Dead. They've started having kids, they're starting to have real consequences to their actions, and that's reflected in this film. You look at a lot of films and they have a man-child. They're lovable, they're huggable, they're people you want to hang out with. He's the guy who knocked you up, who's a weed dealer, who's like totally lovable, and like, you know, even though the stakes are messed up, he's still funny and he's still like a nice guy. And in this film, Simon Pegg's character of Gary King is not a great guy at all. Like, he's totally messed up. He's an alcoholic. He's a screwed up addict, basically. He's not really that lovable. He has a darker edge to him. I think it's interesting that Edgar Wright and Simon Pegg and Nick Frost decided to take such a different approach to the whole man-boy idea. You like Gary King, but you know he has all these problems. You know it's kind of dangerous for him to still be kind of this man-child who's closing in on 40. It's not as simple as like, oh, he's a relatable character and I like him, and he just needs to get over these simple things. He has like a major addiction. He has a lot of problems that he has never dealt with. Simple logline, certainly. It's a sci-fi comedy, but in a lot of ways it's taking a lot of comedy ideas and doing something very different with them, because you have the man-child thing, which they're taking in a very different direction, in a much darker direction, but also the Nick Frost-Simon Pegg relationship is totally flipped in this film. Simon Pegg is basically playing who usually Nick Frost plays, and Nick Frost is playing who usually Simon Pegg plays, and they switched archetypes. It's a good way to close out the Cornetto trilogy, because if you're gonna have them do the same thing, I feel like that wouldn't have felt like much of a challenge. And this does feel like an evolution. It's like, why not turn these ideas that they've been working with for so long and do something different with it. Simon Pegg plays it very darker. He still plays it lovable, and I still like following him, and he's a good protagonist, but he's very flawed. Like, he's playing the Nick Frost kind of role from like Shaun of the Dead as the protagonist, but he's kind of the activator in all of this. It's an interesting way to put and take this relationship. It's also like has a real end to it, and it's like there's a certain point where you have someone who's playing a clown in their career as a comic, and when they start to get older, it gets like kind of sadder. It's like, you're a little too old to do this now, and it feels like they kind of realize like, well, what if we put the expiration date on ourselves before that happens? So it's not like super depressing. Certainly these guys can work on a film together again, and I kind of actually hope they do. I'd be a little sad if this is it. It's almost like a perfect fitting end. Like, they realize like, yeah, you can't keep acting this way. I mean, that's a certain theme with Gary's character, is like, you can't keep doing this even though you have fought against it for so long. Edgar Wright films, I think, are always kind of the full package, and especially this one, because it's like, you laugh, you cry, you kiss $5 goodbye. It's like that whole typical thing. You have a good time, there's like an emotional weight to it, you laugh, there's funniness, there's drama. What the best part of Hollywood filmmaking and blockbuster filmmaking has to offer. You're advertising one thing, but you're wrapping all these other things up in this film. There's so many parts that I'm laughing, but then, like, you know, later it's like a very serious, somber moment. Having all that wrapped up into one, and it's quick cutting and moving all over the place, I mean, Edgar Wright, there's like a precision to him, but there's such a planned out precision that I don't see from comedy directors. Edgar Wright is almost the opposite of most comedy directors because he seems to know exactly what he wants to do. He gets exactly the films he's referencing and he gets the weight of all of that. And he's just a smart director. His films are like the only comedies I could say that are dense comedies. Like if I watch World's End a year from now, there's probably a joke in there I didn't get this time. And 5 years from now, and probably 10 years from now. And I don't know anyone else who can make dense comedies. And comedy isn't easy by any means, and a dense comedy is like even harder. Like Douglas Adams did a lot of that, and there was even kind of some Douglas Adams in here. The action sequences are so well staged. This is shot by Bill Pope, who's a favorite cinematographer of mine. He worked with Sam Raimi on Army of Darkness, he worked on Team America, he worked on Spider-Man 2, he worked on Clueless. He has a very eclectic filmography, and he worked on Scott Pilgrim. And there's a real difference in how this film was shot than I think Hot Fuzz and Shaun of the Dead. And it's like, I feel like Edgar Wright like evolved through cinematography, through each of his films. And the fight sequences in this film when they're fighting with robots are like so well staged and so well done. And I think Bill Pope's a really good action cinematographer because even in movies that he shot that I don't necessarily like, there's usually an action sequence and I'm like, yeah, that movie sucked, but that action sequence was amazing. He knows how to flow the camera, keep the excitement, and keep a staging that's both fun and thrilling to watch as an audience. I'm kind of almost happier that Bill Pope is with Edgar Wright than Sam Raimi right now. Edgar Wright's kind of interesting because he's such a cult classic director. Every one of his films has become a cult classic, but he's like really says a lot about these characters and them growing up. With this film, I think he's really kind of made the ultimate one. Not to say I don't think this is the best film, and I don't want to say that because his films have such a watchability factor that I really think I should have to have seen this a couple times before I say something like that. But like this is it. You gotta fucking grow up. You're turning 40, you know, and at a certain point you are always evolving. And maybe they'll come back to that sort of a thing. But I think they can't do the same kind of idea that Shaun of the Dead started. You need to get your life together, that they're like fighting this sense of conformity. I quite enjoy this movie, and I think a sci-fi comedy is something that turns out a lot of bad movies. Watching someone like Edgar Wright take an attempt at sci-fi comedy, I think has a lot of love in it. I think there's a difference between a lot of the sci-fi comedy where they're like, oh, I'm a funny guy, I kind of like sci-fi. Edgar Wright fucking loves sci-fi. Edgar Wright loves these genres. There's a real sense of love to it. And I think, you know, although Hot Fuzz is kind of really more of going for like Tony Scott and Michael Bay and like a certain director, World's End is kind of like Shaun of the Dead, where it's definitely referencing a few films, but it's really more about these relationships and doing those relationships within a certain genre and showing like an interesting idea through that relationship. And Edgar Wright is very good at that. Edgar Wright's one of the great directors that's going on right now because he has a real sense of himself. He has a real good sense of flow. He can quick cut. He's a really dense director. There's a real love of film through it and messing with these archetypes he's already done. Like, he doesn't want to get stale. Like, there's a real sense of that they're really hinging on something, that they're like, well, if we're going to do this again, we have to be careful, we have to be precise, we have to get this exactly right. Edgar Wright's films really feel like directed, but in a way that's lovely and amazing. This is such a refreshing film to watch, and I'm not sure if maybe because it's so different from what's going on in comedy, because I guess relatively this is like a sci-fi comedy, but there's like drama in it as well. But I think because everything you can compare it to right now is not even a tenth as good as this movie. I love this movie. I had such a good time, and I went with some friends and we did the marathon of the Cornetto trilogy, and I'm happy to have done that. Maybe I loved it more, maybe I loved it too much because of that, but I think regardless of any of this is a very, very good movie, and it's one of the best kind of Hollywood movies I've seen this summer. It's made in a very Hollywood way and in a love of Hollywood movies. And I don't think I've seen one that like excels in such a way. You know, I haven't seen a Hollywood movie that excels at being a Hollywood movie. And you're like, oh, well, it's a British film, it's not a Hollywood movie. It's made like a fucking Hollywood movie. It's made like a major production. And I haven't seen a major production movie made this well, maybe all year. I would go that far. Edgar Wright is a fucking great director, and like watching him close out this stage in his career and maybe move on to Ant-Man. There's a bittersweetness to it, certainly. I kind of wish it wasn't ending. I would see more of these, and hopefully he works with Simon Pegg and Nick Frost again, but If this is the end, this is a fitting end. And it's a good end. And it was a good movie. And I think it was a good way to close everything out. So if you have seen The World's End and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. I could really talk about this movie all day, but I think I've run out of things to say.